The microphone was ripped from my hands. I stood frozen at my father's funeral eulogy pages, shaking in my grip as Victoria's crimson smile cut through the crowd of mourners like a knife. My stepmother, my enemy, the woman who had been circling my inheritance like a vulture for 3 years. She held up a manila envelope. Her voice rang out clear and cruel. "Sarah Peterson is not Richard's biological daughter." The words detonated in the silent funeral home. Gasps, whispers. My father's coffin sat 10 feet away, surrounded by white lilies that suddenly smelled like death. 300 people stared at me. Family friends who had known me since I was 8 years old. Employees who called me Miss Sarah. My aunts and uncles whose faces twisted between shock and pity. "I have proof," Victoria announced, triumph dripping from every word. "Blood tests, DNA evidence. Her mother was unfaithful for 32 years. Sarah has no claim to the Peterson name, no claim to the Peterson fortune, no claim to anything." My knees buckled. The room spun. This could not be happening. Not here, not now, not at my father's funeral. But Victoria was not done. She never was. She pulled papers from the envelope, waving them like weapons. Richard Peterson was O negative. Sarah is AB positive, genetically impossible, which means sweet little Sarah is nothing but a bastard child, and bastards do not inherit empires. Brandon, her son, stepped forward with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Sorry, sis, but you are not really family anymore. Mom talked to our lawyer. Everything goes to us now." The funeral home exploded into chaos. My Uncle Ben was shouting. Aunt Carol was crying. Victoria stood at the center of it all, victorious and vicious, destroying my life in front of everyone I loved while my father lay dead in his coffin, unable to protect me anymore. I thought I had lost everything when Dad died. I was wrong. I was about to lose so much more. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, you'll understand what happened next. But before I tell you how my father destroyed Victoria from beyond the grave, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now if you believe in karma. Subscribe if you want to see narcissists get what they deserve. And drop a comment telling me, has anyone ever underestimated you? Because what Victoria didn't know was that my father had been planning this moment for 3 years, and she was about to find out exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really started. 3 years before that horrific memorial service, back when I still believed that family meant something sacred and unbreakable. My earliest memory of my mother was the smell of cinnamon rolls baking on Sunday mornings. I must have been 4 years old, standing on a wooden stool next to her in our kitchen, my small hands covered in flour as she taught me how to roll the dough just right. Angela Peterson had the kind of laugh that made everyone around her smile, the kind of warmth that filled every room she entered. She wore her dark hair long and always had it braided over one shoulder. Her eyes were green, the color of sea glass, and when she looked at you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. Mom died 3 days after my 8th birthday. I remembered that birthday party so clearly. She had made my cake from scratch, a 3-layer chocolate masterpiece with strawberry filling my absolute favorite. There were balloons everywhere, streamers hanging from the ceiling, and 12 of my classmates running wild in our backyard. Mom had organized games and prizes, and at the end of the party, she pulled me aside and gave me a special gift, a delicate silver locket with a photo of the 3 of us inside. She fastened it around my neck and whispered, "No matter what happens, baby girl, you always have us right here with you." 3 days later, she collapsed while making breakfast. Dad called 911, performed CPR while I stood frozen in the doorway, too terrified to move or speak or do anything but watch my father try to breathe life back into the woman he loved more than anything. The paramedics worked on her for 20 minutes. They took her to the hospital, and Dad and I followed in his truck. I held his hand in the waiting room. Both of us silent, both of us praying to any god that would listen. But 6 hours later, a doctor with tired eyes and a gentle voice told us that Angela Peterson was gone. A congenital heart defect, something that had been hiding in her body her whole life, waiting to steal her away from us. The funeral was the first time I truly understood what grief felt like. It was not just sadness. It was a physical weight crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to believe that tomorrow would come, and she still would not be there. Dad held me during the service while I sobbed into his shoulder, and I remembered feeling his tears falling into my hair. After everyone left after the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, it was just the two of us in a house that felt too big and too empty. Dad threw himself into work. Peterson Hardware had been his dream, built from nothing when he was 25 years old. He had grown up poor, the oldest of 3 kids, and he learned early that hard work and integrity were the only things that would get you ahead in life. By the time I was born, he had 2 stores. By the time Mom died, he had 5. The business was expanding successful, but it required constant attention. Long hours, weekend trips to scope out new locations, vendor meetings, and employee training sessions. But no matter how busy he was, he never missed a single school event. Not one. I remembered the night of my 5th grade science fair. I had built a volcano that actually erupted with baking soda and vinegar, and I was so proud of it. Dad had been out of town at a supplier conference 2 hours away, but he drove back that evening just to see my presentation. He arrived with his tie, loosened his shirt sleeves rolled up, and the biggest smile on his face. "That's my girl," he said, ruffling my hair. "Your mom would have been so proud of you." As I grew older, I started working at the stores during summer breaks. At first, I just helped organize inventory in the back room, but by the time I was 16, I was working the register and helping customers find what they needed. Dad taught me everything. How to read a contractor's supply list, how to calculate board feet of lumber, how to treat every customer like they were the most important person who walked through that door that day. These stores are more than just business. Sarah, he told me one afternoon while we were restocking paint supplies. They are how we serve our community. We help people build their homes, fix what's broken, create something new. Never forget that what we do matters. I loved those summers working beside him. The employees became like extended family. There was Jim Hernandez, the store manager who had been with Dad since the very first store opened. Jim was a bear of a man with a thick mustache and a laugh that boomed through the aisles. He taught me how to cut keys and mix custom paint colors. There was Denise Lawson, the bookkeeper who always had hard candies in her desk drawer and remembered everyone's birthday. There was Marcus Chin, the lumberyard supervisor who could calculate complex measurements in his head faster than most people could with a calculator. They all adored my dad, and they all treated me like I was precious cargo. When it came time for college, I chose to stay local and study elementary education. Dad was supportive, even though I knew a part of him hoped I might want to take over the business someday. But I loved working with kids. I loved seeing their faces light up when they finally understood a difficult concept, loved the way they trusted me to help them navigate their small but significant problems. After graduation, I got a job at Riverside Elementary teaching 3rd grade. The pay was not great, but the fulfillment was priceless. Dad and I fell into a comfortable rhythm. I lived in a small apartment downtown, but I came over for dinner at least twice a week. We would cook together, usually Dad's terrible attempts at pasta or my slightly better stir-fry, and we would talk about everything and nothing. He would tell me about problems at the stores, and I would tell him about my students. We watched old movies together, westerns mostly, which Dad loved and I tolerated. Those evenings were sacred to me. Just the two of us keeping each other company, keeping Mom's memory alive in the way we loved each other. But I started noticing changes in Dad about 5 years after Mom died. He seemed lonely in a way he had not been before. He would stare at her photos longer. He kept her closet exactly as she left it, but sometimes I would find him sitting on the bed holding one of her sweaters, his eyes distant and sad. He was only 58 at the time, still young, still vital, still had so much life ahead of him. When I gently suggested that maybe he should consider dating again, that Mom would want him to be happy, he just shook his head and said he could never replace her. Then, during a regional hardware store convention in Chicago, he met Victoria Thorne. Dad came home from that conference different. There was an energy about him I had not seen in years. He talked about this fascinating woman he had met, someone who was confident and worldly and interested in his stories about building the business. "She's different from anyone I have met, Sarah. She is sophisticated and she gets what it takes to succeed." I knew I should have been happy for him, but something in the way he described her made me uneasy. Their first date was 2 weeks later. Victoria drove up from Springfield, where she lived, and worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. Dad was nervous in a way I had never seen him nervous before. He changed his shirt 3 times, asked me if he should bring flowers, or if that was too old-fashioned, paced around the living room, checking his watch every 5 minutes. When Victoria's sleek black BMW pulled into the driveway, I got my first look at the woman who would eventually try to destroy my life. She stepped out of that BMW looking like she owned the world, and she knew it. Platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves makeup, applied with professional precision, a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She wore heels so high I did not understand how she could walk in them, and jewelry that caught the light with every movement. When Dad introduced us, her handshake was firm to the point of painful, and her smile was the kind that did not reach her eyes. "So, you are Richard's daughter," she said, looking me up and down in a way that made me feel judged and found wanting. "He talks about you constantly. You are a teacher, right? That must be so rewarding." There was something in the way she emphasized rewarding that made it sound like she meant cute, but ultimately insignificant. Dad did not notice. He was too busy beaming at her, helping her into his truck, acting like a teenager on his first date. I watched them drive away with a sinking feeling in my stomach that I could not quite explain. Over the next few months, Dad and Victoria became inseparable. He drove down to Springfield every weekend to see her. She started coming up more frequently, staying the weekend at Dad's house. I tried to get to know her, I really did. We had coffee together a few times, and I asked her about her work, her interests, her life. But every conversation felt like a performance on her part. She said all the right things, smiled at all the right moments, but there was a calculation behind her eyes that never went away. She had a teenage son from a previous marriage, Brandon, who was 17 at the time. Victoria's ex-husband, Marcus Thorne, was apparently some kind of investment banker who had left her when Brandon was 5. According to Victoria, Marcus was controlling and unfaithful, and she had fought hard to get a fair divorce settlement. She is a survivor, Dad told me admiringly. She built her career from nothing while raising a son on her own. I have to respect that. But when I met Brandon for the first time, my unease multiplied tenfold. He was tall and athletic, with his mother's sharp features and an expression of perpetual boredom. Victoria brought him to one of our weekly dinners, and from the moment he walked in, it was clear he did not want to be there. He barely looked up from his phone during the meal, gave one-word answers to any questions, and when Dad tried to connect with him by talking about sports, Brandon just shrugged and said he did not really follow any teams. After dinner, while Victoria and Dad were in the kitchen cleaning up, I tried to make conversation with Brandon in the living room. "So what are your plans after high school?" I asked, trying to sound friendly and interested. He looked at me like I was something he scraped off his shoe. "Why do you care? I was just trying to be nice." He snorted. "Yeah, well, don't bother. My mom says we are only here until your dad figures out what he wants to do about his will and stuff. So you do not have to pretend to like me." I felt like I had been slapped. "What are you talking about?" Brandon smirked. "My mom is not stupid. She knows your dad is loaded. Those hardware stores are worth millions. Why else would she date some old guy who smells like sawdust?" Before I could respond, Victoria swept back into the room with Dad right behind her. She shot Brandon a look that could have frozen fire, and his smirk disappeared instantly. "Brandon, honey, why don't you wait in the car? I need to talk to Richard about something." The kid stood up and left without another word. I wanted to tell Dad what Brandon had just said, wanted to warn him that Victoria and her son were clearly only interested in his money. But looking at Dad's face, at the happiness and hope written there, I could not bring myself to crush it. Not yet. Maybe Brandon was just being a bratty teenager. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was just jealous that Dad had found someone new, and I was afraid of being replaced. So I said nothing. 6 months into their relationship, Dad told me he was going to propose to Victoria. We were having dinner at his house, just the two of us, and when he said it, I nearly choked on my water. "You have only known her for 6 months, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice neutral. "When you know, you know," he said, his eyes shining. "I loved your mother with my whole heart." Sarah and I never thought I would feel that way about anyone again. But Victoria makes me feel alive. She challenges me, she makes me want to be better. And I am not getting any younger. I want to spend whatever time I have left with someone I care about. What could I say to that I thought Victoria was a gold digger, that her son had basically admitted they were after his money, that every instinct I had was screaming that this was a terrible idea. But I looked at my father, at the man who had sacrificed so much to raise me alone, who had put his own happiness on hold for years to make sure I was okay, and I could not bring myself to ruin this for him. I am happy for you, Dad, I said the lie, tasting bitter in my mouth. If she makes you happy, then I support you. He hugged me tightly. You have no idea how much that means to me, sweetheart. I know this has been an adjustment, and I know Victoria can be a bit much sometimes, but she has a good heart. You will see. The proposal happened at a fancy restaurant in downtown Springfield. Dad showed me the ring beforehand, a massive diamond that must have cost a fortune. Victoria said yes, of course, with tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, and a yes that echoed through the entire restaurant. The other diners applauded. Dad looked happier than I had seen him in years. The engagement period was 4 months of wedding planning that felt more like a hostile takeover. Victoria took control of every detail with an iron fist. The wedding would be at the Grand Stellar Hotel, the most expensive venue in the region. There would be 300 guests, most of whom were Victoria's business associates and distant relatives. The flowers alone cost $15,000. The dress, which Victoria showed me photos of obsessively, cost $30,000. When I hesitantly suggested that maybe they could have a smaller, more intimate ceremony, Victoria looked at me like I had suggested they get married at a gas station. This is Richard's only wedding, she said coldly. He deserves something spectacular. Unless you think your father does not deserve the best? Of course not, I said quickly. I just meant that Dad always preferred simpler things. Victoria's smile was sharp. That was before he met me. I am teaching him to appreciate the finer things in life. Dad seemed happy with all the planning, or at least he did not complain. He just wrote the checks and smiled and told Victoria whatever she wanted was fine with him. I tried to talk to him alone a few times, tried to express my concerns, but he always brushed them off. Victoria just wants everything to be perfect, he would say. She is excited. Let her have this. The wedding itself was exactly as over the top as Victoria had planned. The Grand Stellar Hotel ballroom was transformed into something out of a fairy tale, or maybe a nightmare depending on your perspective. Crystal chandeliers, silk drapes, ice sculptures, a 12-tier cake that required its own support structure. I stood next to Dad as his best woman, wearing a bridesmaid dress that Victoria had chosen and that I absolutely hated, watching him marry this woman who I was increasingly certain was going to ruin his life. During the reception, I overheard a conversation I was not supposed to hear. I had stepped outside for some air, overwhelmed by the crowd and the noise and the sinking feeling in my chest. The terrace wrapped around the side of the building, and as I stood there trying to breathe, I heard voices coming from around the corner. Victoria's voice, sharp and irritated, and another male voice I did not recognize. I told you I will handle it, Victoria was saying. Richard is completely under my thumb. The prenup was a setback, but his lawyer is old and sloppy. I already found 3 loopholes we can exploit. The male voice, deep and amused, responded. And the daughter. She seems like she might be a problem. Sarah Victoria laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Please, she is a schoolteacher making $35,000 a year. She has no backbone whatsoever. Richard has her so convinced that she needs to support his happiness that she would never dare challenge me. By the time she realizes what is happening, it will be too late. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I peeked around the corner and saw Victoria talking to a man I had never seen before. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of body that came from spending hours in a gym. He had his hand on Victoria's waist in a way that was definitely not appropriate for a married woman talking to a stranger at her wedding reception. What about the kid, the man asked. Brandon going to play along? Brandon will do what I tell him, Victoria said confidently. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. Richard has already started talking about paying for his college, buying him a car, maybe even giving him a job at one of the stores. the stupid man has no idea that Brandon is not even his biological son. I must have made some sound, some gasp or sharp intake of breath, because suddenly Victoria was looking directly at me. Her expression flickered from shock to anger to calculated friendliness in less than a second. "Sarah, darling, there you are. We were just talking about how beautiful the wedding turned out. This is Rick Matthews, my personal trainer. He came all the way from Springfield to celebrate with us." Rick smiled at me, all white teeth and fake charm. "Congratulations on your dad's wedding. Victoria has told me so much about you." "I am sure she has." I managed to say, my mind racing. I needed to tell Dad what I had heard. I needed to stop this marriage before it was too late. But it was already too late. They were already married. Victoria was already legally his wife. I went back inside and tried to find Dad, but he was surrounded by guests, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. Every time I got close, Victoria appeared like a shadow inserting herself into the conversation, steering Dad away. By the end of the night, I had not managed to get him alone for even a minute. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, tears streaming down my face, knowing I had just watched my father make the biggest mistake of his life, and I had done nothing to stop it. The first year of their marriage was a masterclass in subtle manipulation and control. Victoria moved into Dad's house and immediately began transforming it. Everything Mom had chosen, everything that made it feel like home, was systematically removed and replaced. The floral curtains that Mom had spent weeks sewing by hand were thrown away and replaced with austere white panels. The warm beige walls were repainted in cold grays and whites. The comfortable lived-in furniture was replaced with expensive designer pieces that looked beautiful but were uncomfortable to actually sit on. But the worst part was the photos. Mom's pictures had been displayed throughout the house, on the mantel, on the walls, on the bookshelf in the living room. Not as a shrine, but as a natural part of our lives, a way of keeping her memory present. One by one, those photos disappeared. I came over for dinner one evening about 2 months after the wedding and realized the photos were gone. Every single one, replaced by modern abstract art that meant nothing, that held no memories, that erased every trace of the woman who had made this house a home. Dad. "Where are Mom's pictures?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked uncomfortable. "Victoria thought it might be time to move forward, you know, to make the house feel like ours instead of mine and your mom's." "But Mom was part of our lives," I said, feeling panic rising in my chest. "Her memory is important. Those pictures were important." Before Dad could respond, Victoria swept into the room with a sympathetic expression that did not match the coldness in her eyes. "Oh, Sarah, sweetie, I completely understand this is hard for you. But you have to understand it is very difficult for me to build a life with Richard when I am constantly surrounded by reminders of his ex-wife." "She was not his ex-wife," I said sharply. "She was his wife until she died. She was my mother." "Of course, and no one is trying to erase her memory," Victoria said in that condescending tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable. "But don't you think it is a bit unhealthy to keep living in the past? I am sure your mother would want your father to be happy and move on." I looked at Dad, waiting for him to defend Mom, to defend our family, to tell Victoria that removing those photos was not okay. But he just sat there looking tired and conflicted and said nothing. "I can take the photos if you want them," Victoria offered with false generosity. "I put them all in a box in the garage. You can have them for your apartment." I left that night with a cardboard box full of framed photographs and a heart full of rage. Victoria had been in our lives for less than a year, and she had already erased Mom from Dad's house. What would she erase next? Brandon moved in full-time after graduating high school. He enrolled in community college but barely attended classes. Instead, he treated Dad's house like a free hotel. He slept until noon, left dirty dishes all over the kitchen, took Dad's truck without asking, and demanded money constantly. New gym membership, new gaming system, new clothes, new sneakers that cost $300. And Dad said yes to everything, desperate to build a relationship with his stepson, desperate to make his new family work. I watched it all unfold with growing horror and helplessness. Every time I tried to talk to Dad alone, Victoria was there. She started joining us for our weekly dinners, which meant I could no longer speak freely with my father. She dominated every conversation, steering topics away from anything meaningful and towards superficial discussions about her work, or Brandon's minimal accomplishments, or her plans for redecorating yet another room in the house. Then Victoria instituted the Sunday family dinners. Every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp, I was expected to be at Dad's house for a formal sit-down meal. Missing one required advance notice and a valid excuse, and even then Victoria would pout and make passive-aggressive comments about how family should be a priority. Those dinners were torture. Victoria seated herself at the head of the table in Mom's chair. She would spend the entire meal talking about Brandon's minor achievements like they were Nobel Prize worthy. Brandon got a C+ in his math class. Apparently, he is really applying himself. Brandon joined an intramural soccer league. Isn't that wonderful? Brandon is thinking about maybe taking a business course next semester. Richard, perhaps he could learn the hardware business from you. Meanwhile, every accomplishment of mine was dismissed or ignored. I was promoted to lead teacher at my school, putting me in charge of curriculum development for the entire 3rd grade. When I mentioned it at dinner, Victoria said, that is nice, before immediately pivoting to how Brandon had successfully changed his own oil in his truck. I implemented a new literacy program that significantly improved reading scores among struggling students, and Victoria literally yawned before asking Dad if he had seen the new bathroom fixtures she had ordered. Dad noticed. I saw it in his eyes, the way he would try to redirect conversation back to me, the way he would ask follow-up questions about my work. But Victoria was relentless. She would talk over him, interrupt, or pretend she had not heard him, until eventually Dad would just give up. It was death by 1,000 cuts, this slow erasure of my importance in my father's life. The financial manipulation became more obvious as time went on. Victoria was spending money at an astronomical rate. I started noticing because Dad mentioned offhandedly that he had to dip into savings to cover some unexpected expenses. When I asked what kind of expenses, he waved it off as just life. But the next time I visited, I noticed Victoria was wearing a new diamond bracelet that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. I started paying more attention. New designer purses appearing regularly, a complete wardrobe overhaul every season, spa days that cost more than I made in a week, a luxury gym membership for both her and Brandon that cost $500 a month. And beyond the personal expenses, there were the house renovations. The kitchen was gutted and remodeled. The master bathroom was torn apart and rebuilt with Italian marble. The backyard where Mom's beautiful garden had been was excavated, and a pool was installed along with an expensive outdoor kitchen that was used exactly twice. Dad never said no. He just kept writing checks, kept swiping credit cards, kept draining accounts that he had spent 30 years building. When I very carefully suggested to him that maybe he should look at his spending, that maybe Victoria was going through money a bit too quickly, he got defensive in a way I had never seen before. She is my wife, Sarah. What is mine is hers. I am not going to nickel and dime the woman I love. I am not asking you to nickel and dime anyone, I said gently. I am just concerned. Mom was always so careful with money, and you built this business by being smart about finances. Victoria is not your mother, Dad snapped, and I flinched at the harshness in his voice. I am sorry, he said immediately, rubbing his face with his hands. I am sorry, I did not mean to snap. I am just tired of everyone judging my marriage. Who is everyone, I asked, confused. Ben called me last week, Dad admitted, and Carol before that. They think Victoria is taking advantage of me. Uncle Ben thought Victoria was spending too much. Aunt Carol thought Brandon was disrespectful. And now, you. I married Victoria because I love her and because I want to build a life with her. I know she is not perfect, but neither was I at her age. She just needs time to adjust. I wanted to scream that Victoria was not some young woman trying to find her way. She was 46 years old, perfectly capable of being respectful and reasonable, and she was deliberately isolating him from everyone who cared about him. But I bit my tongue because I could see how exhausted he was, how torn he was between his love for me and his desire to make his marriage work. About 18 months after the wedding, things took an even darker turn. Victoria announced at Sunday dinner that she thought Dad should update his will and his business succession plan. It was presented as a reasonable suggestion. Richard, you have a new family now. You need to make sure Brandon and I are protected if something happens to you. Dad looked uncomfortable. I have a will. Mr. Harrison helped me set it up years ago. But that was before we were married, Victoria pressed. And I am sure it leaves everything to Sarah, which made sense when it was just the two of you. But now you have me and Brandon to think about. Surely you want us to be taken care of. Of course I do, Dad said slowly. But the business is complicated. Those stores employ over 40 people across 3 states. I am not asking you to do anything drastic, Victoria interrupted smoothly. Just make sure the will is fair. Make sure that your son gets the same consideration as your daughter. Brandon is my stepson, Dad said, and I saw Victoria's eyes flash with anger before she controlled her expression. He is your son in every way that matters, she said, her voice taking on a wounded quality. He calls you Dad. He looks up to you. Are you saying he is worth less than Sarah just because he does not share your DNA? The conversation continued in circles with Victoria, manipulating and guilt-tripping until Dad finally agreed to meet with his lawyer to discuss estate planning. I felt sick listening to it, but what could I do? I was just the biological daughter, apparently being greedy by wanting to maintain the inheritance Mom and Dad had built for me. After that dinner, I tried to contact Mr. Harrison myself. Nathaniel Harrison had been Dad's lawyer and friend for over 30 years. He had handled the business formation, all the property purchases, Mom's estate after she died, everything. If anyone could protect Dad from Victoria's schemes, it was him. I called his office and made an appointment claiming I needed advice about my own will. When I sat down in his office, a room lined with law books and smelling of leather and old paper, Mr. Harrison looked at me with knowing eyes. You are not here about your will, Sarah, he said gently. You are here about your father's. I broke down and told him everything. Victoria's spending, her manipulation, Brandon's behavior, the things I had overheard at the wedding, my fears that they were going to steal everything Dad had worked for. Mr. Harrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing graver with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. I cannot discuss your father's legal matters with you without his permission, but I can tell you this. Your father is not a stupid man. He is also not blind. He sees more than you think he sees. What does that mean? I asked. It means, Mr. Harrison said carefully, that Richard Peterson has been preparing for various eventualities. He has asked me to put certain protections in place. I cannot tell you what those protections are, but I can tell you that your father loves you more than anything in this world, and he would never let anyone take what is rightfully yours. But what if he dies before he realizes what Victoria is really doing? I pressed. What if Sarah? Mr. Harrison interrupted gently. Trust your father, and trust me. We have known each other for 3 decades. I will not let anything happen to Richard's legacy or to you. I wanted to feel reassured, but leaving his office, I still felt a gnawing anxiety that would not go away. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving of the 2nd year of Dad and Victoria's marriage. It should have been a happy occasion. Dad's brother Ben and his wife Carol were visiting with their 2 teenage daughters. Dad's sister Emily drove in from Ohio with her husband and their adult son. It was the first time the whole family had been together since the wedding, and I had been looking forward to it because it meant Victoria would have to behave herself in front of everyone. I should have known better. The day started off well enough. Everyone pitched in to help with cooking. Aunt Carol and I made the stuffing and cranberry sauce while Uncle Ben and Dad worked on the turkey. The cousins set the table and caught up on each other's lives. Victoria mostly stayed in the master bedroom, claiming she had a headache, though I suspected she just did not want to participate in actual family activities. But she emerged in time for dinner dressed immaculately as always and took her seat at the head of the table. We all gathered around 20 people crowded around Dad's extended dining table, passing dishes and sharing stories. Uncle Ben started telling tales about growing up with Dad, about the trouble they got into as kids, about the time they tried to build a treehouse and it collapsed with both of them in it. Everyone was laughing, the room full of warmth and connection, and for a moment it felt like old times, like before Victoria, like when Mom was still alive and family meant something pure and uncomplicated. Then Uncle Ben said something about how Dad had always been determined to build something better for his family, how he had worked double shifts at a factory to save up money to open his first store, how proud their parents would have been to see what he had built. Victoria, who had been drinking wine steadily throughout dinner, suddenly set her glass down hard enough that it made a sharp clink against the table. You know what, Ben? Those charming little poor boy stories might have been cute 30 years ago, but they are honestly a bit tired now. Richard has evolved beyond his humble origins. He has refined tastes, now sophisticated interests, a different class of friends. Maybe it is time everyone stopped treating him like he is still some working class, nobody struggling to make ends meet. The room went dead silent. Uncle Ben's face flushed red. Aunt Carol put down her fork slowly. Aunt Emily looked shocked. Dad stood up from his chair, his face pale. Victoria, that was completely inappropriate. He said, his voice tight with anger, but Victoria was not done. She had been holding this in for 2 years, and now, fueled by wine and resentment, it all came pouring out. And while we are being honest, let me address the elephant in the room. You people have never accepted me. You look at me like I am some gold digger who trapped poor Richard. But the truth is, Richard needed me. He was a lonely widower living in the past, running a decent but ultimately provincial business, completely lacking in ambition beyond his little hardware stores. I brought sophistication into his life. I brought culture connections opportunities. Instead of being grateful, you all act like I am the villain for expecting Richard to evolve. She turned her gaze on me, and her expression was pure venom. And you, Sarah, sitting there playing the martyred daughter. You are pathetic. 29 years old, still driving that joke of a Honda, making barely enough money to pay rent, clinging to your father like some kind of security blanket. If it were not for Richard's success, you would be nobody. An absolute nobody from nowhere going nowhere. You are a mediocre teacher at a mediocre school, and the only reason anyone even knows your name is because you are Richard Peterson's daughter. Without him, you are nothing. I could not breathe. The words hit me like physical blows. Every insecurity I had ever had, every moment of self-doubt was suddenly being thrown in my face in front of my entire family. Tears were streaming down my face before I could stop them. Get out, Dad said, his voice shaking with rage. Get out of this house, right now. Victoria's eyes widened. Richard, I said get out, Dad repeated louder this time. And Brandon, you go with her. I will not have either of you under my roof after this. Mom, let's go, Brandon said nervously, clearly reading the room and realizing they had pushed too far. Victoria stood up, grabbed her purse, and looked at Dad with cold fury. You will regret this, Richard. You are choosing them over your wife, over your family. I will remember that. They left the door slamming behind them. The remaining dinner guests sat in stunned silence until Aunt Carol got up and wrapped me in a hug while I sobbed. Dad sat back down heavily, his face in his hands, looking like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I am so sorry, he said to everyone, his voice broken. I am so sorry you all had to witness that. And Sarah, God, Sarah, I am so sorry. Nothing she said was true. You are brilliant and kind, and you have built a life helping children which is more meaningful than anything I have ever done. Please do not believe a word she said, but the damage was done. Even with Dad's reassurance, even with my aunts and uncles and cousins rallying around me, Victoria's words had burrowed deep into my brain. I left that night with a box of leftover turkey and a heart that felt shattered into pieces. Victoria and Brandon came back 2 days later. Dad had apparently decided to give them another chance after Victoria called crying and apologizing, blaming the wine and stress, and claiming she had not meant any of it. Dad, ever hopeful that his marriage could work, agreed to marriage counseling. Victoria attended exactly 3 sessions before declaring the therapist was biased against her and refusing to go back. Things were tense for a few months after that. Victoria was on her best behavior, playing the devoted wife, being overly sweet to me whenever Dad was around. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She had not changed. She had just gotten better at hiding her true nature. Brandon was around less, which I was grateful for. He had switched from community college to an online program claiming it worked better with his schedule. By schedule, he meant sleeping until 3 p.m. and playing video games all night. Dad tried to engage with him, tried to get him interested in the business, but Brandon could not care less. Then came the incident that I did not fully understand until much later. It was a Saturday in October, about 6 months before Dad died. I stopped by the house to drop off some paperwork for a school fundraiser we hoped Dad would sponsor. I let myself in through the garage like always and heard voices coming from Dad's office. The door was slightly ajar, and I started to walk toward it to let Dad know I was there when I heard Victoria's voice, sharp and intense. "We need to do this before he changes his mind, Richard. The beneficiaries need to be updated now. Brandon should be included equally in everything. It is only fair. Victoria, he is my stepson, not my biological son," Dad said, sounding exhausted. "Sarah is my daughter. This business, these stores, I built them with Angela for Sarah's future." "Angela is dead," Victoria said coldly, and I gasped at the cruelty in her voice. "She has been dead for 24 years. I am your wife now. I am your family now. Brandon is your son now. If you truly love me, if you truly value this marriage, you will make us equal to Sarah in your will. Otherwise, you are saying we are worth less than her." "That is not what I am saying at all," Dad protested. "But the business is complicated. There are employees to consider, logistics, succession planning." "I do not care about logistics," Victoria interrupted. "I care about whether my husband values me and my son. Clearly he does not." I heard footsteps on the stairs and realized Brandon was coming down. I panicked and quickly moved toward the front door as if I had just arrived. Brandon saw me and smirked. "Here to check up on your inheritance," he asked mockingly. "Do not worry, my mom is working on making sure we get our fair share." I did not respond. I just left my hands, shaking the paperwork I had come to drop off still clutched in my hands. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for an hour, trying to decide what to do. Should I warn Dad? Should I confront Victoria? Should I contact Mr. Harrison again? In the end, I did nothing. I told myself I was respecting Dad's autonomy, letting him handle his own affairs. But the truth was, I was a coward. I was afraid of pushing Dad further away, afraid of causing more drama, afraid of making things worse. 2 weeks later, Dad called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice sounded strange, serious, but not upset. "Sarah, honey, can you come over tomorrow afternoon? I need to talk to you about something important." "Of course, Dad. Is everything okay?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. "Everything is fine," he assured me. "I just need to discuss some things with you. Legal things, business things. It is time we had this conversation. I will be there, I promised. What time? How about 3 o'clock? That will give us a couple hours before Victoria gets home from her sales calls." The fact that he was specifically arranging our meeting for when Victoria was gone should have alarmed me, but I was just relieved he wanted to talk to me, that maybe he was finally seeing through Victoria's manipulation, that maybe we could start to repair our relationship and protect his legacy. I never made it to that meeting. Dad died at 11:15 the next morning. He had been at the flagship store helping a contractor load sheets of drywall into a truck. Jim Hernandez told me later that Dad had been in good spirits that morning, joking with customers, talking about how he was looking forward to spending more time with his grandbabies once I had kids someday. He lifted the last sheet of drywall, handed it to the customer, and then clutched his chest. His face went gray, and he collapsed right there in the parking lot. Jim called 911 immediately and started CPR. Other employees rushed out to help. The paramedics arrived within 5 minutes, but it did not matter. Dad's heart had given out a massive coronary event that the doctors later said killed him almost instantly. He was 63 years old. I got the call from Jim while I was teaching. My principal pulled me out of class, her face somber, and I knew before she said anything that something terrible had happened. They took me to the hospital, but by the time I arrived, Dad was already gone. He was lying in a sterile emergency room covered with a white sheet, and he looked so much smaller than I remembered. I held his cold hand and sobbed, apologizing for every harsh word I had ever said, every moment I had wasted, being afraid to tell him the truth about Victoria every second I had not spent telling him how much I loved him. Victoria arrived an hour later, dramatic and weeping, throwing herself across Dad's body like she was the grieving widow in a tragic play. I wanted to scream at her, wanted to tell her she had no right to touch him, but I was too numb, too broken, too exhausted to fight. The days following Dad's death were a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls, and unbearable grief. Victoria took control of everything immediately. She chose the funeral home, selected the casket, ordered the flowers, invited the guests. Everything she chose was expensive and showy and nothing like what Dad would have wanted. He would have preferred something simple, something focused on family and friends, not this massive production that Victoria was orchestrating. When I tried to suggest changes, tried to say that Dad would have wanted sunflowers instead of lilies, that he would have preferred Willie Nelson songs instead of classical music, Victoria shut me down immediately. "I am his wife," she said coldly. "I am making the decisions. You are the daughter, and daughters defer to widows. That is how this works." But I drew a line at the eulogy. That was non-negotiable. I was going to speak at my father's funeral, and Victoria could not stop me. We had a screaming match about it in the funeral director's office, both of us crying and yelling until the poor director separated us and suggested we could both speak if we wanted. Victoria grudgingly agreed, probably because refusing would have made her look bad. I spent 3 days writing the eulogy, pouring every ounce of love and grief and memory into it. I wrote about the father who raised me alone, who taught me integrity and kindness, who built a business with his bare hands, who made every person who walked into his stores feel valued and respected. I wrote about a man who deserved better than he got in his final years, even though I did not say that part explicitly. The funeral was held at Fletcher Funeral Home on a cold November day. Light snow was falling, blanketing everything in white, making the world look peaceful, even though my internal world was shattered. The room was packed with people, employees from all 15 stores, customers who had known Dad for decades, suppliers, business associates, family friends. So many lives he had touched. I sat in the front row with Uncle Ben, Aunt Carol, and Aunt Emily on my side of the aisle. Victoria and Brandon sat across from us. Victoria wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than my car, her hair and makeup flawlessly done, despite her supposedly being devastated by grief. Brandon sat beside her in an ill-fitting sports coat, checking his phone every 30 seconds, clearly bored by the whole affair. The service began with music and readings. People stood up and shared memories of Dad. Jim Hernandez spoke about Dad being the best boss he ever had, about how Dad helped him through a rough divorce by giving him extra shifts and a shoulder to cry on. Denise Lawson talked about Dad's terrible jokes and how he remembered every employee's birthday. Marcus Chin shared a story about Dad helping him and his family move into their first house, spending an entire Sunday lifting furniture and hanging pictures. Each story made me cry harder, made me realize how many people Dad had helped, how many lives he had made better just by being kind. This was his real legacy, not the stores or the money, but the impact he had on everyone around him. Finally, it was time for the eulogy. I stood up, my legs shaking, clutching my handwritten pages. I walked to the podium where the microphone stood, looking out at the sea of faces, at the enlarged photo of Dad smiling in his Peterson Hardware polo shirt, at the casket draped in white flowers. I unfolded my pages and began reading. Richard Peterson was more than my father. He was my hero, my teacher, my best friend. He taught me that success is not measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the integrity you maintain. He built a business with his own hands, not to get rich, but to serve his community, to provide for his family, to create something meaningful that would outlast him. My voice was shaking, but I pushed through. He believed in second chances and hard work, in treating every person with dignity and respect, no matter who they were or how much money they had. He taught me that a person's worth is not determined by their bank account or their job title, but by how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them. I paused to wipe my eyes, my vision blurred by tears. As his daughter, I am so grateful that I got 32 years to learn from the best man I have ever known. I will miss him every single day for the rest of my life. I will miss his terrible dad jokes, his obsession with old westerns, the way he hummed while he worked, the way he called me sunshine, even when I was being difficult. I will miss watching him interact with customers, seeing how he made everyone feel important, witnessing his joy in helping people build and create and fix things. I looked directly at Dad's photo, speaking to him now instead of the room. Dad, I hope I make you proud. I hope wherever you are, you know how much I loved you, how much I still love you, how much I will always love you. I hope you know that everything good in me comes from you and Mom. I promise I will honor your memory by living the values you taught me, by being kind when I want to be cruel, by being generous when I want to be selfish, by being honest when lies would be easier. I promise I will take care of your legacy, all of it, everything you built, everything you believed in, I promise. The sharp click of heels on wood cut through my words. I looked up to see Victoria standing, her face set in determined lines. She began walking toward the podium. My heart started pounding. What was she doing? I need to say something, she announced loudly, her voice carrying through the room. This is important. Everyone needs to hear this. This is not the time, Victoria, I said quietly, my hands gripping the edges of the podium. She reached me and held out her hand for the microphone. Now is exactly the time, she said coldly. For truth, for justice, for Richard's real legacy. Her fingers closed around the microphone and she yanked it from the stand. I stumbled backward, confused and suddenly terrified. Victoria turned to face the assembled mourners, and her expression shifted from grieving widow to something triumphant and cruel. Before we say goodbye to Richard Peterson, there is a truth that everyone in this room needs to hear. She began, her voice clear and confident. A truth that Richard himself discovered shortly before his death. A truth that changes everything about inheritance, about family, about who deserves what. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a large manila envelope. My heart stopped. What was she doing, Sarah Peterson? She said my name like an accusation is not Richard Peterson's biological daughter. The room exploded in gasps and whispers. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Uncle Ben jumped to his feet, his face red with fury. Aunt Carol was yelling something I could not hear over the rushing in my ears. I have proof, Victoria continued, holding up the envelope like it was a weapon. Blood type evidence and laboratory results. Richard Peterson was O negative. Sarah Peterson is AB positive. Anyone with even basic knowledge of genetics knows this is impossible. These blood types cannot produce a child together, which means that Angela Peterson, Saint Angela as everyone seems to remember her, had an affair. Sarah is the product of that affair. No, I whispered, but my voice was lost in the chaos erupting around me. She has no biological claim to the Peterson name. Victoria declared, her voice rising. No claim to the Peterson legacy. No claim to the Peterson business or estate or anything else. Richard's real family, his legal family, is me and Brandon, and we will be challenging any will that gives this bastard child what she has no right to have. Brandon stood up and moved to his mother's side, looking at me with mock sympathy that did not hide the glee in his eyes. Sorry, sis, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Guess you are not really family after all. My mom talked to a lawyer. Everything goes to us now. The real family. The funeral home was in complete chaos. People were standing shouting, some defending me, others looking at me with suspicion and pity. Aunt Carol was trying to reach me, but the crowd was too thick. Uncle Ben was yelling at Victoria, his voice booming. I could not move, could not think, could not breathe. My father was dead, his casket was feet away, and this woman was destroying my entire identity, my entire life in front of everyone I knew. Then cutting through the chaos like a knife came a calm, steady voice. Mrs. Thorne, that is quite enough. Mr. Harrison stepped forward from where he had been sitting near the back. He moved with the careful deliberation of an older man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how much power he held. He carried his worn leather briefcase and his face was set in an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, but something colder and far more dangerous. He walked down the aisle and people moved out of his way instinctively. The noise began to die down as everyone watched him approach the front of the room. He stopped directly in front of Victoria, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Richard Peterson anticipated this exact scenario, Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room despite not being raised. He knew you would try to discredit his daughter the moment he could no longer protect her. He prepared for this possibility 3 years ago, shortly after your marriage, when he first began to suspect your true motives. Victoria's confident expression faltered. Her hand, still clutching the microphone, lowered slightly. Brandon shifted his weight suddenly, looking less sure of himself. Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness, building the tension. He removed a sealed envelope, cream-colored and expensive-looking, with my father's distinctive handwriting on the front. The words were clearly visible even from where I stood. To be opened only if Victoria Thorne publicly questioned Sarah's parentage after my death. My knees nearly buckled. Dad knew. He had known this would happen. He had prepared for it. Mr. Harrison carefully broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the now silent room. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning it briefly, and then he began to read in that same calm, authoritative voice. These are Richard Peterson's own words, written in his hand and witnessed by myself and 2 other attorneys on November 15th, 3 years ago. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and read, "If Victoria is hearing this, it means she has done exactly what I feared she would do. She has attempted to destroy my daughter Sarah by claiming she is not my biological child. This is a lie motivated by greed and malice, and I will not allow it to stand even from beyond the grave." Tears were streaming down my face. Dad's words, his protection reaching out from death itself. Let me be absolutely clear. Mr. Harrison continued reading. Sarah Peterson is my biological daughter. When Sarah was 8 years old, she was in a serious car accident that required an emergency blood transfusion. During that hospitalization, her mother and I requested comprehensive blood work and genetic testing, not because we doubted our relationship, but because Angela had just died from an inherited heart condition, and we needed complete medical records for Sarah's future health care. I could barely breathe. I remembered that accident, remembered the hospital, but I had been so young and grief-stricken over Mom that I had blocked out most of the details. The results confirmed with 99.98% certainty that Sarah is my biological daughter. Dad's words continued through Mr. Harrison's voice. I have kept these results sealed all these years at Angela's request because there is a family secret that Angela considered deeply private and wanted to protect Sarah from until she was older and ready to understand. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Angela herself was adopted as an infant by the Johnson family. Her biological father, whom she met only briefly as a young adult, had AB positive blood. Angela knew this biological connection existed, but chose not to pursue a relationship with her birth father, as the Johnsons were her real parents in every way that mattered. She never wanted Sarah to feel confused or burdened by adding adoption into the complex grief of losing her mother so young. We agreed to keep this information private until Sarah was ready to know. My hands were shaking. Mom was adopted. I had a biological grandfather I never knew about, and Dad had carried this secret to protect me. But Mr. Harrison read voice taking on an edge. Now I made sure we had the DNA evidence properly preserved and documented, because I did not trust that Victoria would not try exactly this kind of manipulation after I was gone. Richard Peterson was my father. The proof is irrefutable, documented, and legally verified. Victoria's blood type argument is based on incomplete information twisted to serve her greed. Victoria's face had gone from triumphant to pale to ashen. She looked like she might be sick. Brandon was staring at his mother with a growing expression of horror. But Mr. Harrison was not finished. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out another document in a clear plastic sleeve. And Victoria, since we are revealing family secrets at a funeral, since you have decided that this is the appropriate time and place for DNA revelations, let me share another piece of information that Richard discovered. He held up the document. This is a DNA paternity test for Brandon Michael Thorne. Richard requested this test 2 years ago when Brandon needed documentation for a sports physical at college, and certain questions arose about family medical history. Victoria lunged forward, trying to grab the document, but Uncle Ben and two other men blocked her path. "Get away from me!" she shrieked. "That is fake. That is illegal. He had no right. He had every right," Mr. Harrison said coldly. Brandon was living in his home, eating his food, taking his money. Richard had every legal right to request medical information. The results are conclusive and verified by two independent laboratories. Richard Peterson is not Brandon Thorne's biological father. The probability of paternity is 0%. Brandon is not Richard's son in any biological sense whatsoever. Brandon's face crumpled. He looked at his mother with betrayal and confusion. "You told me he was my dad," he said, his voice breaking. "You told me my real dad abandoned us, and Richard was going to be my new dad, and—" "Shut up," Victoria hissed at him. "Just shut up." Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice rising to override Victoria's. Richard installed security cameras and audio recording equipment throughout his home office and bedroom, after he discovered evidence that Victoria was tampering with his personal files and documents. He has extensive video and audio recordings of Victoria discussing her plans with her personal trainer, one Rick Matthews, to manipulate Richard's will, dispose of Sarah's inheritance, and fraudulently claim Brandon as Richard's biological heir in order to steal the Peterson business empire. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room through the funeral home's sound system, tinny but unmistakably clear. "Once Richard is gone and I get rid of that stupid daughter of his, we can sell those hardware stores for millions, Rick. Brandon will get half since he is supposedly Richard's son, and I will get the other half as the widow. That naive little schoolteacher won't even know what hit her. She is too busy being Daddy's good little girl to see what is coming." Rick's voice came through next. "What if she fights it?" Victoria's laugh was cold and cruel on the recording. "With what? She makes $35,000 a year teaching brats their ABCs. I will bury her in legal fees before she can even get to court. Richard's real family is me and Brandon. By the time I am done, Sarah Peterson will not have a penny of the money her mother never deserved anyway." The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed entirely at Victoria. People were standing, shouting, pointing. Victoria was screaming that the recording was taken out of context, that it was illegal, that we were all conspiring against her. Brandon had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking. I stood frozen at the podium, unable to process what was happening. Dad had known. He had known everything, and he had protected me in the most thorough, devastating way possible. Mr. Harrison raised his hand, and the room gradually quieted. "There is more," he said. Richard also documented Victoria's spending, her attempts to access business accounts, her efforts to void their prenuptial agreement, and her communications with lawyers about contesting Richard's will before he was even dead. He has recordings of Victoria telling Brandon to sabotage workplace relationships at the hardware stores to make Sarah look incompetent if she tried to take over management. He has proof of Victoria stealing company documents and financial records. He has proof of everything. He pulled out one more document, this one thick and official-looking. This is Richard Peterson's final will and testament, executed 6 months ago after he discovered the full extent of Victoria's deception and fraud. It states clearly that upon his death, all business holdings, properties, accounts, and assets are to go to Sarah Peterson, his biological daughter, with the exception of a trust fund to cover Brandon's college tuition should he choose to attend, as Richard believed Brandon was a victim of his mother's manipulation and deserved a chance at education, despite not being biologically related. Victoria receives nothing. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice like ice. Their prenuptial agreement, which she attempted multiple times to invalidate or destroy, remains legally binding. That agreement specifies that in the event of divorce or Richard's death, Victoria retains only the assets she brought into the marriage and nothing more. Given that Victoria entered the marriage with approximately $25,000 in credit card debt and no significant assets, that means she leaves with nothing. Furthermore, Victoria is hereby formally accused of fraud, attempted theft conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and identity theft in relation to her schemes involving Richard's estate. The police are waiting outside to take her into custody. As if on cue, 2 police officers entered the funeral home through the back door. Victoria began screaming a high-pitched wail of rage and fear. She tried to run, but one of the officers caught her arm. She struggled, swearing and crying, her perfect makeup running down her face in black streaks. "You cannot do this!" she screamed at Mr. Harrison. "Richard loved me. He wanted to take care of me. That is what husbands do. I earned this. I put up with his pathetic nostalgia and his boring friends and his stupid daughter for 2 years. I earned every penny." "You earned nothing," Mr. Harrison said coldly. "You married a good man under false pretenses, manipulated him emotionally, drained his accounts, isolated him from his loved ones, and planned to steal from his daughter. You are going to prison, Mrs. Thorne." The officers handcuffed her and began reading her rights. Victoria was still screaming, still struggling as they led her out of the funeral home. Brandon sat motionless, tears running down his face, looking like his entire world had just collapsed. Because it had. In the chaos that followed, I somehow made it through the rest of the service. People came up to me offering condolences and apologies and support. Uncle Ben and Aunt Carol wrapped me in hugs and told me they never doubted me, never believed Victoria's lies. Jim and Denise and Marcus and other employees promised they would help me run the business that Dad had taught them well, and together we could keep his legacy alive. Mr. Harrison pulled me aside after most people had left. "Your father loved you more than life itself, Sarah," he said gently. "He spent the last 3 years of his life making sure you would be protected. Everything that just happened, he planned it all. Every document, every recording, every contingency. He knew Victoria would strike at the funeral because that's when you would be most vulnerable. So he prepared for that specific scenario." "Why didn't he just divorce her?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. "Why did he stay with her if he knew?" "Because he hoped she would change," Mr. Harrison said sadly. "And because he knew that if he divorced her without absolute proof of her fraud, she would take him to court and drag your name through the mud. He needed irrefutable evidence, and gathering that evidence took time. He was going to serve her with divorce papers and press charges the week after he died. He was meeting with you to explain everything, to show you all the evidence to prepare you for the legal battle ahead, but his heart gave out before he could have that conversation. Fresh tears streamed down my face. So he was going to leave her. He was going to fix everything. He already did fix everything," Mr. Harrison said firmly. "Victoria is going to prison. You have full control of your inheritance. And Brandon—" He paused, looking over at where Brandon still sat alone, staring at the floor. "Your father left instructions about Brandon, too. He believed the boy was salvageable if removed from his mother's influence. The trust fund for his education comes with conditions, but it is there if he wants it." "What happens now?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by everything. "Now you grieve," Mr. Harrison said. "And when you are ready, we will deal with the legal matters and the business transition. But there is no rush. Take your time. Your father made sure of that." The next few weeks were a media circus. The story of the widow arrested at her husband's funeral for attempted fraud made national news. "Peterson Hardware heiress vindicated after stepmother's scheme exposed at funeral" was the headline in the regional business journal. Every local news station covered it. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting interviews, which I declined. I took a leave of absence from teaching because I could not function, could not pretend to be okay when I was falling apart. Victoria's trial was expedited because the evidence against her was so overwhelming and because her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She was convicted of fraud, attempted grand larceny, and conspiracy. The prosecution wanted 10 years, but she negotiated down to 5 years in prison, plus restitution of over $300,000 she had taken from Dad's accounts. Even with the reduced sentence, 5 years was a long time. Long enough for her to lose everything: her reputation, her freedom, her son. Brandon was not charged because he was 17 when most of the planning occurred, and prosecutors could not prove he knew the full extent of his mother's schemes. But his life imploded anyway. The community college expelled him when the scandal broke. His friends abandoned him. The kids he had grown up with wanted nothing to do with the son of the woman who tried to steal a dead man's legacy. He came to see me 4 months after Victoria was sentenced. It was a Sunday evening, pouring rain, and when my doorbell rang, I looked through the peephole to see Brandon standing there, soaked to the bone, looking nothing like the arrogant boy I had known. He looked broken, lost, and very young. I opened the door but kept the chain on. "What do you want?" "Brandon, I am sorry," he said immediately, his voice cracking. "I know you have no reason to believe me or forgive me or even listen to me, but I need you to know I am so sorry for everything. For how I treated Richard, for how I treated you, for being part of my mother's plan, even if I did not fully understand it." We stood there in the rain for a long moment. I should have slammed the door in his face. He had helped his mother try to destroy me. But looking at him standing there, rain dripping off his jacket, I realized he was as much Victoria's victim as I was. He had been raised by a narcissist, taught that money and status were all that mattered, never shown what real love or integrity looked like. "Come in," I said, unchaining the door. He sat at my small kitchen table, dripping onto my floor, and the whole story came pouring out. How Victoria had always told him his real father was a deadbeat who abandoned them. How she taught him to view every relationship as transactional. How she trained him to see Richard as a mark, not as a potential father figure. How she made him rehearse scenarios for getting money out of Richard for playing the victim for manipulating situations. How he never really understood how wrong it all was until he saw Richard's coffin and realized that a good man had died and he had helped make that man's final years miserable. "I visited my mom in jail last week," Brandon said, his voice hollow. I thought maybe she would apologize or explain or show some remorse. Instead, she spent the entire visit telling me it was my fault she got caught. If I had been smarter, if I had kept my mouth shut, if I had played my part better, we would have gotten away with it. She said I was useless, that Richard's death was the only valuable thing I ever contributed to her life because it moved up the timeline on the inheritance fraud. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "She is my mother and she is a monster. I do not know how I did not see it before. Or maybe I did see it and I just did not care because I was just like her. But I am not her. I do not want to be her. I want to be better. I want to be the kind of person Richard thought I could be. I could have thrown him out. Part of me wanted to. But then I thought about Dad, about his belief in second chances, about how he had set up that trust fund for Brandon's education, even after discovering he was not his biological son. Dad had seen something in this kid worth saving. Maybe I should too. "I have a proposition for you," I said slowly. "You want to make things right. You want to prove you have changed, then prove it." How Brandon asked, looking almost desperate for guidance. "I am going to give you a job at Peterson Hardware. You will start at minimum wage at the flagship store working under Jim Hernandez, the manager you and your mother treated so badly. You will work 40 hours a week. You will show up on time every day, and you will treat every customer and co-worker with respect and dignity. If you can do that for 6 months without screwing up, without complaining, without quitting when it gets hard, then we will talk about your future. The trust fund your father set up for your education will become available if you prove you are actually willing to change." Brandon stared at me. "You would do that. After everything my mother did, everything I did, you would give me a chance." "My father believed you deserved a chance," I said. "So I am going to honor his belief. But this is your only chance, Brandon. If you mess this up, if you revert to your old behavior, you are done. No second chances, no excuses, no forgiveness. You get one shot to prove you are better than the person your mother raised. Take it or leave it." "I will take it," he said immediately. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I will not let you down. I promise." The first 6 months were rough. Brandon struggled with everything. The physical labor, the early mornings, the humility of starting at the bottom, the hostility from co-workers who remembered how he had treated them before. Jim Hernandez gave him every terrible task in the book: cleaning out the dumpster area, scrubbing the bathrooms, unloading trucks in the freezing cold, dealing with the most difficult customers. Brandon could have quit at any point, but he did not. He showed up every day at 6 a.m. sharp. He did every task without complaining. When customers were rude, he stayed polite. When coworkers were cold to him, he did not lash out. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to change. The arrogant slouch disappeared. The phone addiction faded. The entitled attitude eroded under the weight of honest work. 3 months in, Jim pulled me aside. "I did not think the kid would last a week," he admitted. "I threw everything at him, trying to break him, trying to make him quit so I could tell you he was hopeless. But he took it all. He is actually learning. He is asking good questions, listening to answers, treating people with respect. I am not saying he is perfect, but he is trying harder than I expected. 6 months in, I promoted Brandon to regular sales associate. He cried when I told him, actually broke down in my office and thanked me for believing in him when no one else would. By then, the other employees had started to warm up to him. They saw his effort, his genuine remorse, his commitment to doing better. He was not the spoiled kid who had waltzed in thinking he deserved everything anymore. He was someone who understood that respect and trust had to be earned. 1 year after Dad's death, I made Brandon assistant manager at the flagship store. He had proven himself capable, dedicated, and surprisingly talented at sales and customer service. When you genuinely care about helping people instead of just trying to get their money. People respond, he told me once. Richard tried to teach me that, but I was too stupid to listen. I wish I could tell him I finally understand. I continued teaching during the school year because that work fed my soul, but I dedicated evenings, weekends, and summers to the business. I learned everything I could from Jim Denise Marcus and the other longtime employees. We expanded the business carefully, opening 2 more stores in underserved communities, maintaining Dad's commitment to fair prices and excellent service. Victoria was released from prison after serving 3 years with good behavior. She tried to contact both Brandon and me through letters and intermediaries. We both refused all contact. Last I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was working retail at a discount store 2 states away, living in a studio apartment alone and broke. Her old friends had abandoned her. Her professional network wanted nothing to do with her. She had destroyed her own life in her greed for someone else's. I did not take pleasure in her misery, but I also did not feel sorry for her. She had made her choices. She had to live with the consequences. Brandon and I stood in front of Dad's grave on the 5-year anniversary of his death. It was November, again cold, but no snow this time. We had established this tradition of visiting together, bringing yellow roses, Dad's favorite, and spending some time remembering him. Brandon placed his bouquet carefully on the headstone and stepped back. "Your father saved my life, you know," he said softly. "Not by giving me things, but by seeing something in me worth saving, even when I gave him no reason to, and by loving you so completely that even after his death, his love protected you and gave me a chance to become someone worth saving." We stood in silence for a while, 2 people who were not related by blood, not related by law, but bonded by the legacy of a good man who believed in redemption and second chances. Brandon now managed 4 of the 18 Peterson hardware locations. He was engaged to a kind woman he met at church, someone who knew his whole story and loved him anyway. He attended therapy regularly, working through the damage his mother had done. He was building a life based on integrity and hard work, the values Dad tried to teach him. I found a letter in Mr. Harrison's office 3 months ago, sealed and marked to be opened on the 5-year anniversary of my death. Mr. Harrison had almost forgotten about it, tucked away in a drawer full of other estate documents. He gave it to me at a meeting last week, and I brought it to the cemetery to read aloud. I unfolded the pages, and Dad's handwriting, so familiar and so painful to see, filled the paper. "Sarah, my beautiful girl, if you are reading this, then 5 years have passed since I left you. I hope those years have been good ones. I hope you have found happiness and peace. I hope you have forgiven me for not being strong enough to leave Victoria sooner, for subjecting you to her cruelty, for being so desperate for companionship that I ignored all the warning signs until it was almost too late." My voice broke, but I kept reading. "I know you wonder why I stayed with her once I discovered her plans. The truth is, I needed time to gather evidence. I needed to build an airtight case so she could never hurt you. And foolishly, stupidly, I kept hoping she would change, that somewhere underneath the greed and manipulation was a decent person who could love me for me instead of for my money. I was wrong. Some people cannot change because they do not want to change. I hope Brandon is doing well. I really do see potential in that boy. He was raised by a monster, but he is not a monster himself. If he is reading this with you, Brandon, I want you to know that I forgive you for the role you played in your mother's schemes. You were a kid being manipulated by the person who should have protected you. You deserved better than Victoria as a mother, just like I deserved better than Victoria as a wife. I hope Sarah gave you the chance I wanted to give you. I hope you took it." Brandon was crying now. tears running silently down his face as I read. Sarah, the final section of the letter was addressed to me. You are the best thing I ever did with my life. Not the business, not the money, not any success I achieved. You. Watching you grow into a kind, principled, strong woman has been my greatest joy. Your mother would be so proud of you, and so am I. Take care of our legacy, sweetheart. Not just the stores, but the values. Treat people with kindness. Give second chances when they are earned. Stand up for what is right, even when it is hard. Build a life full of love and meaning. And remember that family is not always the people we are born to. Sometimes family is the people we choose, the people who choose us back. The people who love us not for what we can give them, but for who we are. I love you forever, sunshine. Dad. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my purse. Brandon and I stood together in silence, the cold wind blowing around us, and I felt Dad's presence so strongly it was almost like he was standing there with us. Here is what I have learned from this entire nightmare. Blood means nothing compared to love. Money means nothing compared to integrity, and redemption is always possible for those who truly seek it. Victoria tried to steal my inheritance, but what she did not understand is that my real inheritance was not money or stores or property. My real inheritance was the values my father instilled in me, the knowledge that I am worthy of love and respect, the strength to stand up for myself when attacked, the wisdom to know that forgiveness is not weakness, but the ultimate form of power. If you are in a relationship where you feel used, manipulated, or disrespected, please hear me when I say this. You deserve better. Your worth is not determined by what others take from you, but by what you refuse to let them steal. Your voice, your boundaries, your self-respect, those are sacred. And sometimes the people we think are family are just strangers who share our address. Real family shows up. Real family protects. Real family loves you not for what you can give them, but for who you are. So let me ask you this. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to make you feel worthless? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? What did you do? How did you find your way back to yourself? Drop your story in the comments below, because I promise you someone needs to hear it. They need to know they are not alone. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe in karma and redemption and the power of standing up for yourself, smash that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about real people overcoming impossible situations. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they are stronger than whatever is trying to break them. Remember, your legacy is not what people try to steal from you. Your legacy is what you build when you refuse to let them.